Well, it finally happened. I tested positive for COVID on a Royal Caribbean cruise, and I wanted to share what my experience was like so that way you know what to expect. Hey everyone, it's Matt from RoyalCaribbeanBlog.com, and yeah, unfortunately, on my Alaska cruise towards the very end of the sailing, I tested positive for COVID-19. Now, I'm not sure where I got COVID from. In fact, I'm pretty sure I got it from somewhere outside of the cruise ship, like one of the ports we visited in Alaska, or even maybe the airport or the airplane that took me over to the West Coast, because it can take anywhere from 2 to 12 days for your symptoms to actually show up. So we'll never actually know, but I started feeling kind of weird on day 6, and on day 7, I tested positive for the cruise. I was on a 7-night Alaska cruise from Vancouver, Canada, on Royal Caribbean Serenade of the Seas. And obviously, my experience in terms of what happened may vary from yours, but I wanted to give everybody an idea of what to expect, because I think a lot of people are certainly a little worried, a little concerned about what it's like if you were to test positive on a cruise and what happens afterwards. I think off the bat, when you start feeling a little weird, a little off, denial is probably the first feeling that you're going to have as it relates to COVID. My first symptom was a sore throat, and I certainly wrote that off as just I overdid it. I spent a lot of time on this cruise getting up early, going to sleep late, and on day 6, which was our glacier viewing day, I'd gotten up early. I was outside. It was cold. It was a little rainy. It was dreary. So I just figured I pushed myself a little bit too much, and that's what happened, right? Well, that night, I really had one of those terrible sick nights, where you have like the fever dreams and everything's bad. I woke up in the morning and I knew something was wrong. So my next step was actually test myself before contacting Royal Caribbean. One of my tips for everybody going on any cruise right now is to bring at-home COVID tests with you, just to ensure that you can test yourself without having to call medical. The reason is, if you call medical and you think you might have COVID and they test you, if you have symptoms of COVID, even if you test negative, they may still quarantine you for 24 hours just out of an abundance of caution. So I wanted to make sure that if I was just, pushing myself too much, or I had the flu or something like that, that I wasn't going to be in that kind of situation. I took my own COVID test, and sure enough, it popped positive almost immediately. So my next step was to call medical and let them know of my positive tests. The next thing that happens is the medical team comes up to your cabin and tests everybody, not just me, my wife and kids. The ship's doctor and nurse arrived to give us a quick antigen test each, dropped off some Dayquil, lozenges, and Tylenol to deal with the symptoms that I was experiencing. The doctor listened to my breathing and then told us we'd have the results very soon, likely within an hour. He also mentioned that all the treatment we were getting was totally complimentary from the cruise line. And pretty much an hour later on, I got a call that I was positive, but my wife and kids were negative. Now, let's talk about quarantine, because I think this is probably the biggest concern that everybody has when it comes to getting COVID on a cruise ship, even more so than actually feeling bad. Luckily, I was able to stay in my cabin for 2 reasons. One, it was the last day of the cruise, and we had a 2-bedroom suite. The doctor explained that if I could quarantine myself in one of the bedrooms, I could remain there instead of being moved to a different cabin on a different deck. That certainly seemed like a better idea than going elsewhere. I was not able to leave my cabin at all. My wife and kids could leave the cabin, but had to wear masks and were not allowed to eat in any of the restaurants. So instead, we were allowed to order food from room service at no extra charge. After 1 or 2 orders, the room service rep started calling me to place orders before even I could at certain times of the day. In terms of the food, it's the exact same room service menu as any other guest has access to. And for dinner, we were able to order from the main dining room menu just to give us something different. The room service food gets old pretty quickly. Unlike the main dining room, there's no variation or new options from day to day. I can see how this could become really frustrating if I had been in quarantine for a longer period. In addition, Royal Caribbean provides you with complimentary Voom internet access and free phone service. And another change that you should know about once you enter quarantine is that the daily cleaning of your cabin stops, so it's up to you to take care of that. They will drop off new towels, obviously, if you need so. Now, in terms of checking up, once you test positive, expect a lot of phone calls from people checking in on you. I was quite frankly impressed by the amount of crew members that had called on me and gave me information. I was really concerned about not having access to all the questions about what happens next. But between the medical team and guest services, they ironed it all out. The medical team called a number of times to check on how I felt, and they were happy to provide me more meds if I needed them. Guest services also called to coordinate plans, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But both medical and guest services cross-checked the other, asking me if the other had done certain things to ensure that no balls were being dropped. So let's talk about what happens after the cruise. Guest services provided me options for what I could do at the conclusion of our sailing. Because our cruise was sailing out of Canada, which has public health regulations requiring me to continue to isolate after the voyage ends, I had 3 options. Number 1, I could disembark in Canada and quarantine in Canada for a minimum of 10 days per the Canadian health regulations. Of course, it would have actually been 9 days because I already quarantined 1 day in my cabin. Option 2, I could disembark and take my rental car that I'd already parked in Vancouver before the cruise and drive back to the US. And option number 3, I could have stayed on board for the next sailing. This was kind of a shock to me, quite frankly, but in the paperwork that Royal Caribbean provided, it does list the option of staying on board for another sailing and quarantining on board as an option, provided there is a space for it. And in my particular scenario, there was availability if I wanted to stay on board. If I stayed on board, I would need to quarantine for 4 more days. And if I tested negative after that, I could get off the ship in port and resume normal cruise activities. My family, which of course were still negative, would need to test every day, but they would be able to enjoy the ship if they tested negative. It was pretty tempting to stay on board, but my fear was someone else could test positive since they had been exposed to me, and it just seemed a little too risky. Later on in the disembarkation process, I spoke with another couple that had opted to stay on board and quarantine, and they spent the entire cruise, all 7 nights, on board in quarantine because they continued to test positive. So that really made me feel much better about my decision not to stay on board. So ultimately, I chose the option of taking a rental car and driving back to Seattle to stay there. Had I not had a rental car parked already in Vancouver, I likely would have been stuck in Canada per the Canadian regulations. I had to provide guest services with the address of where I was going and my ArriveCAN number for departure. The most impressive part of the lengths that Royal Caribbean goes to support those that catch COVID during their sailing is the compensation package they provide. Since I was coming out of Canada, which is a country that has regulations about isolation, and I could not drive home to Florida, Royal Caribbean offered me a daily per diem if I quarantined in a hotel. Specifically, it offers reimbursement up to a limit of $250 per hotel room per night, $100 per person per day in meal costs, air change fees up to $400 per person, and $150 US for a rental car cost per day. In addition, all quarantine guests and their traveling party get a prorated refund of their cruise fare based on the time spent in quarantine and cruise time lost. This refund will come back to the original form of payment. This is unbelievable, quite frankly. It's incredibly generous, especially financial support given after you left the ship and are isolating in a hotel. If you get COVID in a theme park, in a hotel, in a resort, in a casino, you're not getting anything from anybody. Maybe you're going to get a phone call or maybe a taxi somewhere, but they're definitely not supporting you like this. And this just shows you the lengths of which the cruise lines go to make sure that you're taken care of. Now, admittedly, if this would have been totally different, if this had happened in Florida, for 2 reasons. One, I could have driven home because I live in Florida, but also number 2, because the public health regulations in Florida are different, don't require you to continue isolating after your voyage ends. There are different rules and different compensation available to you. But the good news is that if the country you're sailing out of has these requirements, there's some pretty generous compensation options available for you. In terms of the actual disembarkation process, we were instructed to wait in our cabin until all the other guests were off the ship. At 9 a.m., some crew members came to take my luggage, and it would have been brought down separate from everybody else's luggage. At 9:45 a.m., a crew member came to escort us out of our room and off the ship. They escorted us actually first to a conference room where eventually 10 other COVID-positive guests joined us in there. This represented 11 out of 2,100 guests, or just 0.5% of the guests on our sailing that had caught COVID. In waiting, we all kind of shared our stories about how we had caught COVID, how it all happened in there, and most people appear to be heading into a hotel in Vancouver that Royal Caribbean had arranged for them in order to continue their quarantine. We were then taken off the ship and into a van to take us to our quarantine place. The bus dropped me off at my rental car location, which was parked nearby, and then I was on my own from that. I got my car, picked up my family, we drove across the border to Washington, and quarantined for an additional 4 more days in Washington before flying home. So here's my advice for anybody that's going on a cruise anytime soon, as long as COVID is still a thing. Number 1, I think it's really important, I talked about this earlier in the video, bring some COVID tests with you to test in your cabin. Again, just to be on the safe side, it's much easier for you to test yourself to ensure that you're not having, maybe allergies or some cold rather than COVID. Having an at-home test is really important. You can even bring the cheapo tests that you can get, at Walgreens, something you can just verify on your own that it is or is not COVID before you call medical. Number 2, this is really important. Have some shows or movies downloaded on your mobile device to watch. Most streaming services you subscribe to allow you to download programming offline to watch, like on an airplane. So it's really important because the Royal Caribbean television is really limited. There's just not anything to watch on there. You'll get sick of the television programming pretty quickly. And I was glad that I had a couple of shows already downloaded for my airplane ride home because it really made a difference. I also recommend bringing extra prescription medicine for a possible quarantine and bring a few over-the-counter flu medications with you. My wife had packed ibuprofen and some Halls, but I wish I had daytime and nighttime Dayquil or even Mucinex to help deal with my sore throat. But even having just ibuprofen made a huge deal. So, in conclusion, here's my thoughts on what happened. I was probably different from most people in this situation because I already knew ahead of time a lot about what cruise lines were doing with people that tested positive for COVID. I was really interested to see how much truth there was in some of the subjective comments that people had made about their experiences. Yes, the room service menu gets tiresome, and if I had to eat it for 3, 4, or more days, I probably would have hated the food as well. But I never got food that was cold or anything that was really bad. People just kind of report about that. Sometimes it maybe was lukewarm, but certainly no different than any other food I would have gotten in the main dining room, which sometimes comes very hot or maybe lukewarm or so. So it was totally fine. I freely admit I was lucky to have to only quarantine for one day on board because the TV programming was limited and there was no pay-per-view movies on Serenade of the Seas. Moreover, the slow internet on Serenade of the Seas made streaming pretty much impossible, although I will admit YouTube worked pretty well because it just seemed to buffer their services a lot better than I thought. I thought the support from medical and guest services was exemplary. I was encouraged to call with any questions, so when I wasn't sure about mixing meds, I called the medical center and got a hold of my doctor almost immediately. My primary care physician at home isn't nearly that accessible. Besides how bad is quarantine, my other concern was communication, because I had read some people lamenting gaps in time before knowing what was going to happen next. I started my ordeal around 7 a.m. By lunchtime, I had a good idea of what the game plan was, and by 4 p.m., I was clear on disembarkation and what to do after that. I knew when I booked this cruise, and every other cruise I've taken since June 2021, that there's a risk of getting COVID on board. I was fortunate not to have to run into this until now, but I can't say it was handled well. It would have been a heck of a lot easier had this cruise gone out of Florida because I'd much rather quarantine in my own home and I wouldn't have had to fly, but the generous compensation package helped quite a bit. I'm not sure what sort of compensation options there are if the cruise had ended in the USA, which likely had different requirements than that of Canada. And I wanted to touch on one more thing because I had actually shared my experiences on RoyalCaribbeanBlog.com, and some people had pointed out, Matt, clearly they knew who you were from RoyalCaribbeanBlog.com, and you got preferential treatment. And my answer to that was at no time in any of the crew members I had talked to did I ever get the sense that they knew who I was. Whenever I talk to crew members who know who I am, they almost let on immediately that they read the blog or they let me know that they know who I am. It's very clear about that. They don't beat around the bush. No time did I ever get that sensation. And then talking to other people at the end of the cruise, my experience seemed very much the same as everybody else. So I firmly believe I did not get any preferential treatment at all during my quarantine period. So there you go. I hope this helps a little bit in terms of what to expect as it relates to quarantine if you have COVID on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. Let me know in the comments any questions you might have. And while you're down there, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on your notifications so that way YouTube lets you know we have a brand new video to share. This has been Matt from RoyalCaribbeanBlog.com, and we'll talk again real soon.